Hello, hello, hello. Okay, so today we are going to be talking so much about our sourdough starters, and you can feel free to ask questions in the comments. I will try to get to them on here, or I will answer them afterwards and make sure to post them. I also got a lot of your questions in the little box that I set up yesterday, and so I will be answering those on this live. I wrote them all down. So also, if you want to give me a little note about where you're tuning in from, I am here in Wisconsin, just over the Minnesota-Wisconsin border, and just a little bit about myself and my sourdough journey. I have been baking sourdough for 3 years. I have kept my starter alive for 3 years. And her name is Nida. I named her after my great-grandma. And I encourage you all, if you have your starter or are getting a starter, to name him or her. It just makes it a little fun. So, today I'm going to be showing you that starter and talking through that process, because I think a lot of you are probably starting this sourdough journey and have maybe never baked sourdoughs before, and the starter is like the main question that we all have, and where, you know, kind of a lot of this like uncertainty comes from. So I am going to flip my camera around. I have a special cameraman, Brian, who is gonna film me so I can show you all these neat things about the starter. So give me 2 seconds here and I will flip this. Oh no. There we go. Okay. All right. So here we are. Okay, so this is my starter. I'm gonna show you. I fed her last night, and you can see all of these bubbles throughout, and you can see if we go in tight, you can see what that looks like on top here. You can see the bubbles forming on there. And this is a lot of the activity in here. So another way to tell, I keep a little marker where my starter is typically when it's unfed. So it's right here. And then after feeding it, it rises, and you can see it's more than doubled in height because it's very strong and very active. So let's talk a little bit more about this crazy thing called a starter. So a starter is the yeast, basically. It's a culture that you create that is the yeast in any type of sourdough bread that you're making. The yeast is what makes it rise. It also has the cultures that can give it some of the flavor, and it's pretty magical. So what happens in a starter, all it is a combination of flour and water when you begin. And a lot of people asked, can I start my own sourdough starter from scratch? So yes, you can start your own sourdough starter from scratch, and there are several people who have tutorials on how to make your own starter. When I began, it was really hard to start a starter from scratch. And so one of my friends told me it's much easier if you have someone who has a starter who can give you some of theirs, because all of those organisms and the bacteria has been building its strength, and it will be much easier for you to get your own going. So I got mine from her, and she's amazing. My friend Emily, she is of the Clever Carrot. She wrote a whole cookbook on sourdough, which is who I learned from, and she also gave me some of her starter. And that's how I started mine. Now, if you don't have a source for a starter, some of you know, and some of you have already gotten my starter, I can give you some of my starter. You just wanna send me a direct message, and it's $11, and I will send it to you in the mail with all the instructions. So that kind of answers that question of like, can I start a sourdough starter from scratch? You can. It's harder, especially if you don't really know what it should be looking like. So this starter, one way to tell when your sourdough starter is ready. Okay, so obviously we want to look at the height and we want to look at the bubbles. Those are all really good indicators that those gases are working, that it's creating some lift. And then the third way that you can tell is you can, and this is a method from the Tartine book of sourdough, but you can take a little teaspoon and water, and what you're gonna do is just take a little bit of it, you don't need a lot, and you're gonna put this in there, and if it floats, it's ready to bake. And you can see it's floating. So go down to here, you can see. So you can see that it is ready to bake. Now, you'll learn too that you don't, as you get more used to doing this, you don't have to always test it like that, but when you're first starting, it's a really good way. And that sank just, it doesn't need to float for a long time. So when it's at this point, I will tell you that when you're starting your own sourdough starter, be patient for it to get to look like this. It could take, 5 to 7 days of feeding the starter. And we'll talk about the process of feeding it and discarding, because I know that can be kind of confusing, after I show you how to just even mix the dough. So right now, we're gonna mix this dough since this is ready to bake, and I'm gonna show you exactly how easy this is. So I highly recommend using a scale, and you'll notice that any sourdough recipe, the measurements are in grams, and that's really important for sourdough baking because it's a little bit scientific, but you don't have to think about it, but it's more scientific in the terms that weight, it does not equal volume. So if you, for instance, 1 cup of flour isn't the same weight as 1 cup of water, and those percentages of how much they weigh are really important for the sourdough bread to be made correctly. So a scale is a really inexpensive baking tool, and I think you'll find that you use it a lot more than you think just for sourdough baking. And they, this one I think is $20. There's a couple of them, that you can get on Amazon for even under $15. And I have some of those resources on my blog of which ones that I like. So this one is made by OXO. I've got it on grams here. And what I'm gonna do is, one thing to note too, when you're working with your starter, you always want to use something that is silicone or wooden, never metal. And that's just because this can attract bacteria that you don't want in here and can sometimes kill your starter. So you always want to make sure to use something like silicone, a spatula. So my regular bread recipe is using 50 grams of starter. I'm going to make a little smaller loaf today, so I'm going to do 40 grams. Oh, and I want to show you too what this looks like when I stir it. So the other way to tell that your sourdough starter is ready is it will have the texture kind of roasted marshmallows. So if you think of really stretchy and puffy and fluffy, you can see all of that happening here. So we're just gonna add 40 grams. So, this also shows 42, close enough. Something else to think about is you probably are wondering I don't have a ton of starter. And you're right. You don't need a lot of starter for most recipes. 50 to 75 grams of starter. So I keep a small amount of starter on hand and feed it smaller amounts instead of feeding it lots, because what then happens is this becomes unmanageable, right? If you're feeding it, and again, we'll talk about the discard process, but you're gonna have so much more discard if you have a large volume of sourdough starter. And you can still use sourdough discard, but again, I prefer to keep a smaller amount because I don't like to waste as much. So anyways, there's that, 40 grams. And now I'm going to add, this is just water that's about room temperature. And my formula for this is, it's about, oh, I forget what the hydration is. That's why I don't even pay attention to that stuff. But I'm adding 300 grams of water here. So I'm just gonna add this. And I'm reading upside down, so let's hope I stop correctly. There we go. All right. Then I'm just gonna give it a little stir. And this is just to kind of incorporate it. And then you're gonna add your flour. I use King Arthur organic bread flour and King Arthur all-purpose flour. The starter is fed with King Arthur all-purpose, organic all-purpose, and we'll talk about that too after I'm done mixing this. But to make bread, we're gonna use bread flour. It has a higher protein content, which means that it can be like, give you that stretchy, really great texture of bread and the chewiness that you want. So and then I always add a little bit of some sort of like whole grain flour. Lately I've been using einkorn flour, and that's what I'm gonna use, just a little bit of that today. So I need a total of 400 grams of flour. So I'm gonna do maybe like 30 to 40 grams of einkorn. And I add just a little more, or I add a little of a whole grain flour, just to give it a little more flavor and also a little bit more nutrition. So here I've got my bread flour, so now I'm just gonna go all the way to 400. Okay, so I'll take a little out. All right. And then the last thing that you add is salt. I mean, this is so basic, right? You don't need a lot of ingredients. Your flour, your starter, water, and salt. So one thing that's good to know is use fine salt because it's going to dissolve easier within the bread. And I use a pink Himalayan sea salt just because of the minerals that it has. You can use other salt if you want just regular table salt. But I'm gonna add 8 grams of salt. All right, so there we go. Now, all we're gonna do is just stir it gently with your spatula. If you wanna come in closer. And you'll see kind of some of the bubbles in there starting. And this is one of my most favorite parts, actually. So we're mixing this. You can see that it's pretty much, you know, it's decently incorporated. And now what I'm gonna do is just use my hands. I'm gonna take my ring off. And we're just gonna mix it all together to get this shaggy, shaggy dough. We are not kneading this at all. Basically, you're just incorporating the flour. And what we're gonna do then is let it sit for 30 minutes. This is called an autolyse. I don't even know if I'm saying that correctly, but that's the term that you'll hear. And what this does, this little rest time, is that it allows the flour to absorb the water and the grains in there to absorb the water so that it's gonna be easier to handle and also just like give it time to work. So that's the first step there of sourdough bread making. And I'm just doing this to get all this flour off my hands. Okay, so I'm just gonna let this sit, and you can see this is very shaggy. There is nothing special to this. So this now sits for 30 minutes. So we'll just let this, and I will show you the next process of stretching and folding that we do. But let's talk some more about the starter. So some of you had questions on what do I feed my starter, how often do I feed my starter. how often do I discard my starter, all of that type of stuff. So let's start from the beginning, and what you want to use to feed your starter is all-purpose. I use organic because that's what I like, but it's not completely necessary. The one thing that you do want to be sure of though is that you're using unbleached flour. And that's why I really like King Arthur's. And that's because, you know, this is a pure organism. This is microorganisms, you know. You don't want that bleaching, those chemicals in there. You want this to stay pure. So the reason, you may have seen recipes for other starters that are made from like rye flour or whole wheat flour or anything like that. And you can totally do that. This is not to say that you can't make starters like that. The reason that I learned to use all-purpose flour to keep my starter is that if you can kind of think of your starter in the one with all-purpose as like the mothership, and then if you wanted to make another rye starter or something like that, those are called the levains, and you can do those per batch of bread you make. So if you find a recipe for, you know, rye bread, you can make a rye starter using this as like your mothership. But we want to keep this always the same, and that's why we use all-purpose, so that it can be very versatilely used across any type of bread that you want to make. So that's kind of what to feed it. And let's talk about water. So actually, I'm going to feed it right now so you can see what this is. So typically, well, let's talk about the water. So water, you want to use a filtered water. And again, that's because if you don't know what's in the water that's just coming in your house, you know, most of us drink filtered water too, whether we're using a Brita or whatnot to filter it. You don't want any type of chemical or residual things from your water going into your starter because, you know, A, it's not good for you probably to be eating, but also it could interfere with the activity of those organisms in your starter. So, filtered water. If you have, I had someone ask me, what if I have well water? And is it completely necessary to use filtered water? If you have well water and you've had it tested and you feel really good about it and you drink it every day, I would say go ahead and feed your starter that. That's not an issue. It's just like for us, this is a really old house. We know that our pipes aren't great, and we know that there's things in the water that we don't want to have in us, and that's why we drink filtered water too. So anyways, that's a little bit of what to feed your starter. How warm should the water be? Again, room temperature when you feed it. You don't want it too hot because it would kill the good bacteria in there and the wild yeast, but you don't want it too cold either because it's gonna be really, really slow to grow if it's too cold. So room temperature is great, or even 75 degrees is good too. So let's talk about feeding it. Now, there's a lot of questions about discarding. Why do I need to discard? Is it completely necessary to discard? And yes, it is completely necessary to discard. And the reason that is because what you want to think about, what's in here is the flour and the water are, as they're sitting, they are eating, the bacteria is eating those things, and that's energy for it. And once all that energy is used up, and the energy is what you can see makes it rise and makes it fall. So when it's risen, that means it's eaten that energy and it's gotten really tall. But soon, that will fall because it doesn't have any more energy. And so what's left is depleted. And it's not going to stay strong if you just keep the depleted energy in there. So we need to take some of that out, but still keep some. So I discard about 1/3 to 1/2 every time of what's left when I discard. And it doesn't have to be precise. So when you take that out, you're then feeding it with new flour and new water. And basically you're giving it new energy and new life to rebuild and give you that wild yeast that you want. So I typically feed my starter about 20-ish to 25 grams of water and 20 to 25-ish grams of all-purpose flour. And the reason why I keep it at a pretty small amount, some might say, is because I know that for most of the bread recipes that I'm baking from, the amount of starter used is about 50 grams. So I don't need to be feeding it like 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water every day and then having to discard all of that. Now, if there's a time where I'm baking like bagels, sourdough bagels, I think I need like 150 grams of starter. All you need to do is the next time that you're feeding it, or for 2 feedings, you want to feed it a little bit more so that you can build up how much actual volume of starter you have. So I might bump that up to, 60 and 60 for 2 feedings. And that way I'm going to have quite a bit more starter that I can use up. So for right now, I'm just going to feed it 25 grams of flour and 25 grams of, I don't have bread flour. So I'm just gonna do, and again, I'm using the spoon not to stir it, but just to add this, which is fine. So, got it. This is such a delicate process. Oh, see, then it's too much. But sometimes the scale's a little weird in it. There we go. Okay, so 25, and then this little 0 button makes it go to 0. And I know that now I just add my 25 grams of water. It's a little more, not a big deal. Don't stress if it's not like exact. I think people, when it comes to starter, sometimes think a little bit too much about it, and it's really, you'll get the hang of it, trust me. It's just kind of experimenting. So now what I want to do is I want to stir this fully to incorporate everything and get all of that flour incorporated, and so you don't see any flour streaks. Okay, there we go. And as you start to use your sourdough starter and feed it more, you're gonna understand what it looks like when it's ready, what it's not look like, how it smells. All those things are gonna be different. And so a lot of this process on getting on this like sourdough baking train is really like experimenting and just being aware of what happens and being familiar with it. So now let's talk about storing this. This is an Abigo, it's a beeswax wrap. And this is just a small cutout. I like using this because it just kind of molds to the jar. And as you know, beeswax is not airtight. So whenever you're covering your starter, you don't want to like use a jar or a cover that would screw all the way completely tight, because you need air and oxygen to go in there, because it's one of the components that helps the starter come alive. So if you don't have a beeswax wrap, you could use something like cheesecloth, just cut out a little square and put a rubber band on it. Even just like a piece of fabric, of loose fabric that you have, and just put a rubber band around it. Totally fine. You just don't want to cut off the oxygen source. So, and when you're first starting, I really recommend having a little mark or using a rubber band around the bottom of when you've fed it, so you can see if it's doubling or not. And the thing too is your starter is going to take different amounts of time to rise depending on the environment you're in, the humidity of your home, the temperature of your home, the temperature of your water, like all of these certain things. And that's why, for it, like when the people will ask like, how long does it take for it to rise, to be ready to bake? And I'll say, it could be between 4 and 8 hours. It's really hard to know. And so what you want to use is more of like this instinct that you're learning from watching its behavior. And as you keep your starter for longer periods of time, you're really going to get used to how it reacts. Now, my starter is really strong. Like I said, I've been baking like this week almost every day. I've been feeding it every day, sometimes more than once. And so, you know, it's really active, and it's usually to its peak within 4 to 5 hours. But some people, when it's a little bit sluggish and maybe they haven't baked in maybe a couple of days and it's been in the refrigerator, it might take more like 8 hours to rise. And that's okay. But again, use those clues that we talked about to learn, you know, how you can know when it's ready for baking. And patience. I think patience is super key too. So I'm just gonna let this sit now, and you can even see like there is still some activity going on in there, even though it's just been fed. So we will set that over here. I'm just gonna look at my questions to make sure I answered. Oh, someone had asked, you ever add a yeast strain like to your starter or to the bread you're baking? And honestly, that's the beauty of sourdough, is that the wild yeast is so strong that you don't need to add any commercial yeast. And that's, like I said, that's really amazing and really magical, and I think it's part of the satisfaction of sourdough baking. And someone asked too, how much starter do you really need to discard? And like I said, it needs to be about a half or a third every time that you are going to feed it. Sometimes people also ask me, I don't think I can keep this thing alive. I'm going to kill it. I travel. I do this. Well, none of us are traveling right now, but it's a myth, because I have gone, 10, 12 days without feeding this thing. And the way that you do this is the refrigerator. The refrigerator acts as since it's cold in there, it's just gonna slow down the fermentation process. So for instance, when I know that I'm going on vacation and I'm gonna be gone, let's say 11 days, I will feed this right before I leave. So, and maybe a little bit more too, because it's gonna be a longer time that I won't be able to feed it. So I wanna make sure that it has enough in there to eat over a long period of time. So I might, feed it 40 grams flour and 40 grams water. So I'll do that the night before I leave. I'll put this top on just like I would do if it was sitting on the counter, and I will put it in the refrigerator. And it will be completely fine when I get back. And like I said, the reason that it is it's just slowing down that process of fermentation. Now, when I get home and I want to start baking again, you're going to take it out of the refrigerator, and it's going to be a little sluggish, right? It's hungry. It hasn't been fed for a while. So you're going to discard, all of a half of that, and you're going to start feeding it again. And what I recommend is, if it's been stagnant for a while and you haven't baked for a while, feed it for 2 days before you plan on baking again. And I would even, that first day you take it out, feed it right away when you take it out. So discard, feed it, let it sit on your counter, and then that night, discard and feed it again, so that it's really getting some more energy. And then the next day, you can do that one time, discard and feed it again, and it'll start to be potent again. And again, just use those clues that we've talked about to know, okay, is it back to being ready to bake? Yes, it is. Here we go. So yes, you can do this. You can keep your starter. You will not kill it. Keep it in the fridge. You're good to go. Is there a question?
Yeah. Where do you store that when it's not in the fridge? Okay. Sunlight, no sunlight?
Yes. So when you are just storing this on the fridge, or out of the fridge when you're going to bake, like the day that you're going to bake, I just set mine right on the countertop, not in the sun. You don't want it to get too hot, because if, think of like when you're sitting in the car, and sometimes you've been sitting in the car for a while and the sun rays are like burning you, You don't want that to happen to your jar, which would then kill the wild yeast and the bacteria that's in there. So just keep it on the counter, out of the sun, and you're good to go. And I would say you find the warmest spot in your house as well, because it's easier for it to grow when it has an environment that is warmer. So cold is one of those things, like that's why you put it in the refrigerator. It slows it down. Heat will make it rise faster. And so right now, something that I do, because it's winter, well, it's the end of March, but we're in the north, so it still feels like winter. So it's cold in our house. So I have this little cupboard that has a heat vent in it, and it stays nice and warm in there, about 72-ish degrees. So I keep it in there on the days that I'm feeding it and gonna have it rise to be ready to bake. So that is what I do with that. So now this is kind of, you know, showing you a little, because sourdough is like a process that takes place over, you know, 24 hours because of the fermentation process. The bread that we mixed, and we let that dough sit. Now this is a little bit sooner than a half hour, but I just want to show you what it's called to stretch and fold. And stretch and fold is what we do to strengthen the gluten and the protein strands in the bread, so that when you are ready to bake, it doesn't just like fall flat in your pan when you set it out. So we want it to hold its structure so that when it bakes, it can rise into this beautiful little bubble-shaped bread. So this first time, over the course of 2 hours when you're making bread, and you don't have to do this, like your bread will certainly still work if you don't have time to stretch and fold. But stretch and fold typically happens each half hour of the first 2 hours of your bulk fermentation. So what you're gonna do, I'm just going to incorporate this dough a little bit more since it's still kind of shaggy. But stretching and folding is basically, and this probably won't work because it hasn't relaxed enough, but it's basically just picking up the sides of the dough. And normally this, once it gets more hydrated and it starts to relax, it will be much easier to stretch. But you basically get the idea. You're just kind of turning it on itself. Now, unlike regular bread making, you're never doing the like punch and knead, because what that does is it will deflate a lot of that activity that's happening in there and the rise. But another day, I'll show you next week when I do my second live, I'm going to show you more of the stretch and fold on what it would actually look like, and you'll see that the dough comes up, and you'll just pick up each piece and kind of fold it alongside each other. So this will continue to sit since I was just kind of running through that auto-lyse process, auto-lyse, however you say it. So I'm gonna let it sit here a little bit longer, and as you can see now, this is something that happens often. You'll be full of dough, which is okay. So next week, I'll go more over the process of when we're ready to bake, what does it look like, how to shape it, how to put it in a banneton, what a bench scraper is used for, and any other things that I think of in the meantime. If you don't have Emily's book, I think it's something that beginning sourdough people should really get. This is what I learned from. She taught me everything I know. I certainly am not an expert either, but I'm confident that you can learn everything too that you really need. So I would highly recommend this book if you're just starting. I do have another loaf that I have going. I'm gonna check it. So this I mixed up yesterday, and this isn't quite ready yet. So it's been fermenting in the fridge overnight, and then I pulled it out this morning. And what I want is for this to be more jiggly and to see a few bubbles around the edges. and that will let me know that it's ready to be turned out onto some marble and then shaped into what would be the bread and bake. So it's not quite there yet, but it will be, and next week I'll show you what it looks like when it is ready to lay out. So were there any other questions?
Yes. Does starter cause a funky smell in the house?
No, starter does not cause a funky smell at all. It's very contained to this, and it's not a weird smell. It's actually when it's at its stage where you just feed it, it has a very sweet, yeasty bread smell. And as it rises, since it's producing more alcohol, it will have more of like a nail polish smell, but never like a rancid smell, never like something that's molding or anything like that. It's not a bad smell at all.
Then does it give a sour taste, I'm assuming?
So sour taste. A lot of people will be surprised when you eat your first loaf of sourdough that it doesn't taste like the traditional San Francisco sourdough that many people have, how it kind of got its name. And it doesn't have a sour taste unless you use your starter after it has fallen from its peak and you mix the dough. So a starter will rise to its peak, and at that point is when it has as much energy as you want. You will use that to bake. If you let that fall a little bit, there's gonna be more of that, the alcohol in there, which is what gives sourdough a taste that's sour. So that if you wanted that sour taste, you would let it fall a little bit after its peak and then use it to mix your dough. I personally, I like a little bit of sourness, but I find that most people, it's really a cool thing to have bread that is full of all of this gut healthy nutrition that tastes way better even than white bread. And that's what I think is kind of the fascinating part of it. So, and it also makes it super versatile, right? Like, sourdough, if you made it the other way, which is the San Francisco way, that means you're using some sourdough starter, like this, and then you're also adding commercial yeast. So yeast you would find in the grocery store. And what that does is it makes this rise much, much quicker. So in effect, you don't need the time of the fermentation, and it speeds up the process. That might be helpful for some people. However, you don't get any of the that gut healthy bacteria that's fermenting over the course of, a day or so when you're making real wild yeast sourdough. So hopefully that answered that question.
Yep. And then people are asking about where you got the canisters because they liked them.
Oh, canisters. Yes. I had a hard time finding canisters that were big enough. And these I just got from Target online. And they are, because I can't look. They're a certain ounce size. I think they're like 96 ounces, and 96 ounces will fit a 5-pound bag of flour, which is like what I traditionally get. And these are like $15 each. So
you can put it in the comments later.
And I can put it in the comments later. Yep, I can put a link to it. Yeah.
Great.
Okay, awesome. If you would like sourdough starter, just remember to direct message me and I will send you starter, and it's $11 and we just do it through Venmo, and then I also give you the instructions as well. And I have other resources on my blog, heartbeatkitchen.com. But yeah, I'll be coming on next week too to do more, and feel free to throw out any other questions, okay? Bye! Okay, wait, yeah.